Gresham College presents Markets in Their Place, Moral Values and Limits of Markets by Professor the Lord Plant.
As has been said, the series of lectures over the 3 years will look at various aspects of how religious groups, faith communities as they're sometimes called these days, churches, however you want to designate them, come to grips with the political, legal, economic and general institutional setting of a liberal democratic society. And I mean, it's fairly obvious, this is something I'll discuss more next year, but it's fairly obvious that things like the Human Rights Act and the Equality Act have caused a certain amount of difficulty for those of a religious persuasion, and how in a modern society are we to accommodate the idea of equal rights with strongly held views about beliefs which are thought by those who hold them to be quite close to their basic sense of identity. How do we justify within a liberal society laws which in some people's understanding of those laws may well require them to do things that are wrong? So that there are lots of issues to discuss about how churches, faith communities relate to the institutional order of a liberal democratic society. But for this year, I want to concentrate on the issue of the economy and the market economy, because the market economy is usually taken, I think quite rightly, to be an essential element of a liberal democratic society. And of course it is a matter of great controversy at the moment what the moral framework for the market economy should be. Only last week the weekly report on LIBOR, the LIBOR scandal, focused intensely upon the lack of probity in some of the responses or some of the activities that went into the situation that led to our present troubles over LIBOR. So, and this, of course, engendered a lot of debate amongst the commentariat in the newspapers and so forth about the moral framework of the market. The sit-in at St. Paul's Cathedral a few months ago engendered the same kind of controversy, and it is a matter of ongoing concern what is, what should be, what can be the moral context for the market economy, and so on. And of course it's this debate that allows those who belong to faith communities to have some kind of input, because if one took the view that an economy and how it's managed and what its implications are is purely a technical matter, then of course faith communities, the churches, have no position to maintain over how the LIBOR rate or whatever it might be should be fixed, what constituent elements should be part of it. But if there is a kind of moral dimension to how the economy works, then of course it's perfectly reasonable for any citizen, whether of religious custom mind or not, to have a view about that moral framework. In 1926, in the middle of the general strike, the churches, particularly led by William Temple, who I think then was Bishop of Manchester, tried to mediate between the employers and the employees in the coal mines. And Stanley Baldwin said that this was as appropriate as what was the then equivalent to the CBI setting up a committee to discuss the revision of the Athanasian Creed. That one, that was a technical matter for the churches, and the issue of economic management was a technical matter for economists, businessmen and politicians, but definitely not for the churches. Now, it's part of my sort of general thesis in these next few lectures that we can't, in fact, regard the way an economy works as a purely technical matter. That isn't at all to deny it. I've spent most of my life in universities rubbing shoulders with economists and so forth. It isn't at all to deny that there are large important and indispensable technical aspects of economic life and political economy and so forth. I would be an utter fool to deny all of that, but there is also this moral dimension in which concerned citizens, whether of a religious persuasion or not, can have a legitimate voice. And I want to try to identify a bit more clearly than I think is often done in the kind of newspaper commentaries and so forth, exactly where these moral issues lie and what in fact might be an appropriate way of thinking about them. Once you've identified them, what's the appropriate way of thinking about them, and what contributions specifically, given my role as Gresham Professor of Divinity, Christian or religious thought more generally might have in thinking about these things. Now, today's lecture is going to be sort of self-contained, but it does raise issues that I'll try to discuss in much more detail in subsequent lectures. And what I want to do is to identify three areas of the market economy that I think are particularly troubling from a kind of moral point of view. The first of these is what you might call the moral underpinnings of markets. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I'll just tell you what the three things are. Firstly, what are the moral underpinnings of markets? Secondly, what is the appropriate sphere of markets? Can we actually give good reasons rooted in some kind of moral standpoint for, as it were, plotting the boundaries of markets? And then thirdly, I want to look at the moral consequences of markets. And all of these three are, I think, of equal importance. There may well be others, but I think these are three pretty central things. So let's make a start with the idea that the market has to have moral underpinnings. Now, the crucial point here is that central to the market economy is the idea that in order to work effectively, the market is thought by many to require certain moral attitudes on the part of those who are involved, and that there is some danger in these moral underpinnings being disturbed by the very operation of markets themselves. Now, the first element of this is that the market economy rests upon the idea of the pursuit of self-interest pretty clearly, that in a market I seek to maximize my utilities, I seek to pursue my advantage, whatever it might be, and that this pursuit of self-interest is the motor of the market economy, and usually that kind of self-interest is regarded by economists as one of the best elements in the explanation of how markets work. The so-called rational economic man or rational economic woman is someone who rationally calculates their self-interest. But of course, central to markets is the idea of contract, whether an explicit contract in a legal document and so on, or a kind of tacit contract in that if I buy your oranges for £1, then you will give me the oranges when I give you my pound. There's a kind of either an explicit contract or a tacit contract. Now the problem is, if we are rational economic actors, what is the relationship between rational pursuit of self-interest and the maintenance of this contractual framework? Because as the great French sociologist Émile Durkheim once argued in quite a pithy comment on this, that not everything in the contract is contractual. That in order to explain how contracts work, you can't just invoke the idea of self-interest. There has to be some kind of underlying commitment to the notion of trust. There has to be some underlying commitment to the idea of probity. There has to be some underlying commitment to the idea of honesty and fair dealing, and so on. And those moral elements are essential for contractual relationships to work. That is to say, you cannot understand the idea of contract purely in terms of self-interest, because there have to be these other values at stake as well. And if morality comes to be seen more and more in terms of self-interest, given that that is the motor force of the market, if market relationships extend themselves more and more throughout society, so that that rational calculation of self-interest becomes more and more important across society, then isn't that degree of self-interested behaviour, which is essential to the operation of the market, likely to undermine the values which are equally essential to contract, without which the market cannot exist, because exchange relationships are either explicitly or tacitly contractual relationships. Now, there's an argument to the effect, and this goes back a long way in Western history, that the economic market, in fact, has rested on an inherited range of values, inherited from the Abrahamic religions, Judaism and Christianity in particular. In this argument, I fully accept that Islam is also one of those religions, but is not really relevant to this particular point that I'm trying to make. That in fact, there is a set of values that has historically formed the context for the emergence of the market economy. I mean, this is very much the theme of Max Weber's famous book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. That the Protestant ethic was an essential condition for the emergence of the capitalist economy, largely because the Protestant requirement of a limit on self-indulgence meant that people actually tended to accumulate wealth rather than spending their wealth on personal satisfaction. And in that accumulation of wealth was an essential precondition for the development of the capitalist economy. And many people have drawn from that the idea that without this framework of moral values, which historically capitalism rested on, then there is a problem about how capitalism can work effectively, how a liberal market economy can work effectively, if that historic heritage of moral values has become more and more eroded. So how do we understand the relationship between a kind of cultural inheritance of a framework of values, as portrayed by historians of capitalism and so forth, and the framework of an economic market that is the motor of which is self-interest and the rational calculation of utility? Now, you might say, well, there's really no problem here, because as this cultural inheritance becomes eroded over time, partly because of capitalism itself, but also because of secularization, so that these values, rooted as they historically were in religion, have less and less salience as religion becomes more and more privatized or marginalized in society. So if capitalism, if a liberal market economy can no longer draw quite as directly upon an inherited framework of values, how then do we manage the liberal market? Well, the argument is that it can be managed perfectly well through the regulation of self-interested behavior. But there's a difficulty with that kind of idea. First of all, partly because the rule of law itself, which in a sense is embodied in regulation, the rule of law itself depends upon quite widely diffused moral values in favour of the idea that the law should in fact be protecting this, that or the other set of values or relationships or institutions or whatever. You can't detach the idea of the rule of law underpinning regulation from the framework of values in society any more than you can detach the market economy from this inherited set of values. But also, more importantly, for the particular argument that I'm making here, is the following notion, that if all there is to the individual motivation in the market is the rational pursuit of self-interest, then of course I have no reason as a businessman, a trader or whatever, I have no reason not to pursue, so far as I possibly can, the achievement of monopoly for my business. Now of course monopoly is wholly against the overall interest of the market economy. And the difficulty then is, how do you relate the idea of my own self-interest in pursuing something like monopoly? How do you relate that to a sense, well, it's a bad thing for the market as a whole, even though it might be in my self-interest? Don't we need some idea in the economic market of what you might call an equivalent to civic virtue, a recognition of the importance of the integrity of the market as a whole, even if that runs against my own self-interest in trying to pursue monopoly in my particular business. And it applies equally well to relationships with the state, that it's in my interest, perhaps, for me to pursue legal privileges, subsidies and so forth for my business, but those privileges and subsidies and so on may well act against the interests of the market as a whole. So we need some idea of the value and the importance of the institution as a whole, not just what is in my own particular interest or what is in my firm's interest. And of course, some of that applies precisely to the LIBOR scandal, that it may well have been in the interest of particular banks or particular traders in particular banks to do what they did, but it is radically undermining of the market as a whole. So if you say, well, all there is rational self-interest, if that's all morality is, then how do you understand the idea of the integrity of the market as a whole when that is against your own self-interest, pursuing monopoly, pursuing rent-seeking behaviour from government and so forth? So there's this kind of dichotomy between a recognition of some kind of collective importance for a market and the idea that markets are driven by the rational pursuit of self-interest. And of course many market theorists, going back certainly to Adam Smith, have realised that. I mean, Smith's idea of the impartial spectator was in the theory of the moral sentiments was essentially the idea that the constraint on private utility maximisation was always, well, what if everybody did that? Or what if everybody did that over a sufficient length of time? But we seem to have lost that idea. And the problem is, how do you revitalise the idea of there being some kind of, if you like, sense of the integrity of the market as a whole when it conflicts, or may well conflict, with rational self-interest? One of the only times, just a little anecdote, that I've had the opportunity to talk to Margaret Thatcher in the House of Lords, she suddenly said, in one of those rather collywobbling kind of moments, what was the worst thing John Maynard Keynes ever said? So I said, I don't know, what do you think it was? And he said, well, the worst thing he said was, in the long run, we're all dead. And I said, well, you know, why do you think that was the worst thing he said? Because it's obviously true, but he said, but the reason why it was the worst thing that he ever said was because it removes the idea that you should defer gratification. Because if in the long run you're dead, why should you constrain your behaviour by any kind of moral principle? Why should you do that? And that's really the dilemma of how to constrain rational self-interest against that of as what I call the integrity of the market as a whole. Now, the other point, the second element that I'll go into these things more as the lectures develop, but the second thing I wanted to draw attention to was, can we actually plot limits to markets? One of the things that was pretty central to the Thatcher governments was the idea that what had come to be called in the 1970s and 80s ungovernability, the idea that the state had become far too big, and that because it was far too big, it was actually unable to act with authority. Its reach exceeded its grasp, that the state's reach exceeded its grasp, and it was important to strengthen the authority of the state by narrowing its sphere of activity. That otherwise the state will lose legitimacy if it covers too much of our lives and cannot act effectively in those areas that it covers. So what we have to do is to improve legitimacy by narrowing scope. Now, my suggestion is that there might be a similar process, a parallel process, that is true also of markets. That if we think that markets can in fact be extended to cover virtually every sphere of human life, then we may get into the same problems of legitimacy as was true of the state 30 years or so ago, assuming you accept the thesis of ungovernability that was popular at that kind of time. That don't we need, in order to maintain the legitimacy of markets, to have some idea of where the boundaries of markets lie? I remember reading an article once by Gary Becker, famous Chicago economist, that begins, and it's on the economics of the family, and it just begins in a rather blithe way by saying a family is best understood as a paternalistically managed firm, and it then went on to explain family interactions in wholly utility maximizing ways as if it was a firm. Now, some people might well think that somehow the market analysis has gone beyond its appropriate sphere. I mean, the idea that it is best understood, a family is best understood as a paternalistically managed firm, is, I think, a rather dubious one, to say the least. So, can we in fact plot some kind of boundary to markets? What would be an appropriate boundary? Many people have qualms about if you start from a fairly consensual position, that in this country we don't allow blood to be bought or sold, we don't allow organs to be bought or sold, we don't allow commercial, at least public commercial relations, renting a uterus for a surrogate pregnancy and so forth. That there are certain things that we regard as beyond the sphere of markets. Now, this doesn't prevent people from arguing that they should be within markets. Certainly the Institute of Economic Affairs argued a lot during the 60s and 70s that there should be a market in blood instead of a donation system. And a man called Simon Rottenberg, a liberal market economist, published a rather chilling essay once called The Production and Exchange of Used Body Parts. Now, most of us, I think, would feel that there was something going wrong if we thought that human bodies, living human bodies, should be used as commodities. But what is wrong with that? Why should we have that view? I mean, it's in a sense a limiting case for the extension of markets. Why shouldn't you be able to sell your blood, your kidney, your sperm, or whatever it might be? Why shouldn't you be able to do that? Because after all, if you own anything, you own your body. And isn't it a restraint on trade to have laws which prevent you from marketing bits of yourself? Well, one of the kind of moral blocks in the way of that kind of attitude would be the idea drawn from Immanuel Kant, which in turn was drawn from Christianity, the idea that it's wrong to treat yourself as a means only, a means to the ends of others. That in fact the idea of human integrity, the idea of respect for persons, in fact, means that you can't treat or you shouldn't treat yourself in this kind of way. Now, when Kant was writing, it wasn't anything as exotic as blood products, but he was very concerned about the castration of choir boys for the Sistine Chapel Choir. He was also bothered about the sale of teeth and hair to make wigs and false teeth for people who could afford them in those days. But underlying his idea was that there is a basic principle of respect for persons and some idea of human integrity. But how are we to make sense of that idea of human integrity if we've jettisoned a lot of the moral framework that has made the idea of moral integrity, human integrity, the idea of respect central? Because after all, if what matters is the rational pursuit of self-interest, if I can actually improve my lot by selling a kidney, why shouldn't I be able to do it? So what are the limits of markets? What are the boundaries beyond which they shouldn't go? And of course, then you can get into much more contested, politically controversial areas like, should there be a market in healthcare? Should there be a market in education? And so on. I'm not proposing to discuss those today, but lying at the boundary of that is this idea that we shouldn't turn into markets those things which are essential to what it is to be a person. Now, there is the view, because it's not just a matter of what it is to be a person, there is some idea that our idea of virtue, of something that is good, should not be part of what is bought and sold. There's a kind of commonly held view, which you hear often in sort of discussions on the radio and things like that, that you don't value something unless you pay for it. Now, I mean, this must be wrong, because there are lots of things that we all do value enormously, and which, if you pay for them, they are destroyed in the process of paying for them. Love being the most obvious example. If you pay for love, you've destroyed what it is you're trying to get. And the same is true of many other virtues, benevolence, duty, and so on. That if you think these are all tradable, that they can all be sacrificed to self-interest, and that they have a financial price, then you're actually destroying a whole range of very important human values, courage, things like that. And we all value them, but we don't think we should pay for them. It can't be right to think that the only things that are valued are things that we pay for. And if that's so, that gives an indication of another kind of limit to a market about what will be sacrificed if we don't, if we do think you can pay for these things. But it's also important to recognise that there can't be rights to these things either. You can't have a right to love. You can't have a right to a courageous action on my part. You can't have a right to my benevolence and so on. That these are values, these are virtues which are beyond both markets and the law. And they have to be recognised as fundamental to our civic relationships while being exempt from both market and legal processes, because whether it's in terms of rights or whether it's in terms of financial payment, you destroy precisely these virtues by turning them either into legal entities like rights or turning them into commodities that can be bought and sold. So we do need to have some idea of these moral limits to markets. And I think a lot of those ideas are rooted in a religious framework. Whether they can be detached from that framework, what sense can you make of the idea of human integrity? What sense can you make of the idea of respect for persons and so forth, if you jettison the framework out of which they've arisen? Because I think historically that's how they have arisen, the idea of humanity being valuable because man is made in the image of God and all that kind of thing. How do you, if you are a purely secular, going on a purely secular basis, how do you make sense of these ideas? I'm not saying you can't, only that it's quite a challenge to understand how you make sense of these ideas against the important and central and unavoidable role for self-interest in human life, exemplified very much in the activity of markets, which are becoming more and more prevalent. The third element I wanted to look at is the idea of the moral consequences of markets. We might want to say, well, look, markets are highly efficient, they raise living standards for everybody over time, and so on. And I don't want to deny any of that at all. But there are also consequences that we have to take some kind of moral judgment about. And one of these consequences is around the issue of justice. Now, there is a view very much associated with the work of Friedrich von Hayek, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, and Ludwig von Mises, also an Austrian economist, as Hayek was, that the issue of justice has little or no relevance to markets. And their argument has various strands, and it's worthwhile just disentangling those strands, because the upshot of it is that they would detach markets from at least one strong moral element and would turn them into what the economist Fred Hirsch, the late Fred Hirsch, who was at the University of Warwick, called in his book The Social Limits to Growth, that markets would be in principle unprincipled. And the argument of Hayek would go like this. First of all, it's all very well talking about the injustice that markets might lead to, inequality, poverty of some people and so on. It's all very well talking like that, but it's essentially beside the point. Justice and injustice only arise through intentional action. So, for example, if it rains on your cabbage patch and your cabbage flourishes, and the sun shines on my cabbage patch and it dries up and dies, that is bad luck. It is not an injustice, because no one intended that it should happen. If I am born with a genetic defect so that my life is constrained and you are not, my genetic defect is not an injustice. It's terribly bad luck, but it's not an injustice. And the reason why it's important to distinguish between bad luck and injustice for Hayek is that we naturally think it's the job of government to rectify injustice, but we don't think it's the job of government to rectify bad luck or misfortune. So first of all, in Hayek's view, injustice can only be caused by intentional action. Now, how does that relate to markets? Well, in a very subtle way, because Hayek's argument is this. In a market, millions of people buy and sell for all the particular reasons that they have. And no doubt, in the vast majority of cases, all that buying and selling is done intentionally. But the aggregate outcome of all that intentional buying and selling is that some people end up rich and some people end up poor. But that aggregate outcome is an unintended consequence of the aggregate of all of those individual acts of intentional exchange. Because the outcomes of markets are unintended, they're not unjust. And we bear no responsibility as a society for seeking to change the outcomes of markets. It's no good saying the outcomes of free markets are unjust, because if they are genuinely free, then the outcomes are the unintended aggregate of all these intentional actions. So whatever the degree of inequality might be as the result of markets, that is not an injustice. And we have to recognise that in Hayek's view. He also argues that the outcomes of markets are unforeseeable. So, and that would be another reason for thinking that they're not unjust. So the important thing here is that markets are separated from any idea of justice and injustice, except in one respect. That is, that each act of exchange between two people, or however many it might be, is unjust if it is unfree. That we have the idea in markets of free exchange. And if market relationships are uncoerced, if they are free, then the outcomes are just. Are neither just nor unjust. They are legitimate because they are the result of individual choice and individual free exchange. So the question then is, if Hayek is right, and that market exchange is free between individuals, uncoerced, then you cannot have an unjust outcome arising from a free process. So there are these two elements of his view. One is about the unintended nature of the claimed injustice of markets, and the second is that if market exchange is free, then the outcomes of markets cannot be seen as, in some sense, unjust, because you can't have an unjust outcome emerging from individual acts of free choice. So those two arguments then lead Hayek to say that, in fact, markets have to be detached from these considerations, these moral considerations, if you like, the framework of justice that for the past 150 years at least has been thought to be a legitimate constraint on markets. We should not be constraining markets in the interests of social or distributive justice. Markets should be left to their own devices, and we deal with the consequences in terms of other considerations rather than those of justice or distribution. Now, Hayek recognises, and this is in the second volume of his book, Law, Legislation and Liberty, he recognises that many people think, quite wrongly in his view, that a free market economy should somehow embody a moral perspective. Now, for Hayek, it doesn't. It is, as Hirsch says, in principle, unprincipled. There are no moral principles surrounding the outcomes of markets. But he says, the trouble is, Hayek says, the trouble is, most people believe that there is such a moral framework. And his argument is that, first of all, if markets are successful, then people will forget about the moral framework because their material wealth will increase year by year and so forth. And that will lead to a detachment. The market will be seen as a mechanism for increasing wealth, And the fact that it has been associated with ideas of injustice and so forth will be forgotten about. But you say, what would happen if markets did fail? Well, he says in a rather remarkable passage, we should probably teach children, this is round about page 71 of Law, Legislation and Liberty, Volume 2, we should probably teach children the untruth that markets do promote justice. Because if people don't think that markets promote justice, they will lose their legitimacy if the promise of material increases in wealth are no longer fulfilled. We will only tolerate markets, in Hayek's view, if either we're doing very well out of them, or if we have the false belief, because it is a false belief in his view, that markets will in fact increase the sense of justice in society. So he's actually advocating that we teach an untruth about the market. It's kind of like a Plato's noble lie about the market in order to preserve its integrity. Its integrity may be preserved in most people's view because they think it increases justice. It doesn't for Hayek, but it may be quite a useful thing for people to believe wrongly that it does. So we're back to this question that we started with about the integrity of the market as a whole. How do you relate an understanding of that to some sense of self-interest and the maximization of personal utility? Now, there's a lot more that could be said about everything that I've mentioned this afternoon, but as I said, I wanted this to be a reasonably self-contained talk, but I will be trying to look at these things in a lot more detail and bringing in a wider range of thought, including ideas from various religious strands of thought to illuminate, I hope, some of these things. And we'll do that next time on the role of choice and markets, and whether what exactly is the relationship between markets, freedom, choice, and coercion. And I think there are a lot of quite fascinating issues there. But on that note, to allow a certain amount of time for questions, I'll finish. Okay.
It seems quite concerning that one of the most famous economists of the last 100 years, who actually received a Nobel Prize for his work, Hayek, thinks that morality doesn't belong in our economic affairs. And I'm wondering how on earth this could have happened, because even back in the early 19th century, the philosopher Hegel put forward the idea that that capitalism needed to be controlled and managed because there was a tendency within capitalism for at least some people to try to amass as much as they could for themselves, and that this was detrimental to modern society. So we seem to have gone backwards. Why didn't people listen to Hegel? And are there some answers in Hegel and Kant and other figures within the philosophical canon that can help us?
Well, I would hope so, because I've made part of my career writing about Hegel, so if Hegel doesn't have anything much to say about this, I probably wasted my time. But yeah, I mean, you're quite right. But the big difference between Hegel and Hayek is this, I think, that one of Hayek's reasons for wanting to detach the market economy from, if you like, a substantial view of morality is that he took the view that in what he calls a great society, an open society, a modern society, a non-tribal society, a society that isn't based upon common ethnicity or common religious beliefs and so forth, that modern society will be highly pluralistic. It will have divergent views. It will have different views about morality and so on. Now, Hegel accepted some of that, but certainly not all of it. And he distinguished between what he called morality, Moralität, and ethical life, Sittlichkeit. And for Hegel, morality is about individual choice, if you like, of the sort that Hayek's talking about. But Hegel also thought that some sense of a shared ethical life focused upon certain kinds of virtues that weren't a matter for trade, of the sort that I was talking about earlier, like love and courage and all those sorts of things, which you can't pay for, and if you do try and pay for them, you destroy them, that those things were an absolutely indispensable part of a society and were beyond both price and choice, in that you couldn't envisage a society working without these things. So Hayek wants to, in a sense, jettison Hegel's idea of ethical life in favour of a pluralistic, subjectivist view of morality. And this becomes the focus of part of his criticism of social justice, because he says it's all very well rabbiting on, as the churches do incessantly, for example, about social justice. But you've got to get beyond that. You've got to say, well, what would a just distribution of resources be? And then, when you're trying to answer that question, you will find that people have radically divergent views. I mean, do you seek to distribute things according to desert? Do you want to distribute things according to equality? Do you want to distribute things according to need? Do you want to distribute things according to entitlement? Do you want to distribute things according to contribution? And so on. And these would yield radically different kinds of forms of distribution. But they would reflect the diversity of values in modern society.
Thank you. Did Hayek have anything to say about transparency? It seems that in the recent years, transparency has almost been invented because it didn't exist before, and it is now thought of as a virtue.
Yes.
And a lot of things disappear if you can brush the cobwebs away or untangle the mess in the middle.
Yes, I mean, it's a good question, but it's also, I'm afraid, a rather complicated answer, which I think I'll have to defer some of to future sessions, because for Hayek, one of the major themes of Hayek in his other writings, apart from those strictly on economics, is the idea that we cannot actually be wholly transparent. That the search for some idea of a transparent understanding of our motives, our intentions, and so forth, is a will-o'-the-wisp idea. And he's got a very complex argument about that has to do with, well, it has to do with virtually everything. I mean, he brings Gödel's theorem into it, and Cantor's theory of sets and so forth, as to why you can't actually understand human nature, human life, human motives and so forth in a wholly transparent way. So the ideal of transparency is never actually going to be a feasible one. It's always going to be something that is a matter of degree, and as I said in the second volume of Law, Legislation and Liberty, is far from being transparent, because he said it'd be quite a good idea to propagate these false beliefs about markets in order for markets to maintain their legitimacy in a situation in which their delivery of higher living standards is failing. It can't be the foremost value, I think, for him. Where I think he would want to emphasize transparency is on something that I mentioned earlier, that crucial to the idea of his understanding of a free market is the idea of free exchange, that exchange is uncoerced. Now, how do you understand coercion? We have to be clear about that in Hayek's view. So we have to have a transparent understanding of the relationship of exchange to ensure that it's not coerced. Because if I am coerced into exchanging with you, then that is unjust for Hayek, and we will only know whether I have been coerced or not when that relationship is fully transparent. But in general, he thinks that transparency is a kind of very dubious, rationalistic sort of doctrine, which can never be remotely fully achieved, I think.
Yes, my points are not philosophical or academic. I've worked for many different companies in many countries, and what may be considered moral or ethical here in London is a very different view when you get into countries that I've worked in. But I think we have a real dilemma here that is insoluble. There are no limits to growth. The British government, I live in Canada, the Canadian government are desperate for growth. They must drive GDP, and they look to the private sector and to the big contributors. And in Canada, that's mining, it's oil, it's natural gas, it's forestry. They try and regulate them through laws. There are laws here. And as I've worked in the Middle East, Indian subcontinent, North Africa, I've had laws that have, in theory, controlled the way I behave, but only in retrospect and after the fact could the law catch up with me. And with many examples here of where the city, the banking community, investment houses have been, in theory, constrained within the law, and then a few years later, the law said, well, you've misbehaved. And they try and bring, in retrospect, the force of the law to bear. The final point is that we live in a small world now. And so we can have contractual law and laws constraining how I would behave as a businessman in Iran, but the Iranians have a very different perspective on contractual law, and my job would have been to reconcile the two as best I could. But my question really is that I don't think we can manage this. I really don't. The politicians in Whitehall will do their best to have legislation and wave the iron fist and say, this is how you will behave in business. But business houses at board level are obliged to try and drive turnover, drive the bottom line, increase shareholder value, and by doing so, their own bonus system. That's the way the system works. And we've seen now some of the scandals that have arisen. So you've dug a very deep hole today, and it's a bag of worms. I don't think there's just some kind of Shangri-La that we're aiming for to control these things.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that's a very important point. Perhaps just 2 points at this stage, and again, sorry to keep promising about what I might do in the future, but some of these things will come back, I think. But just a couple of points. Well, they're related, really. One is this, that there's a kind of an argument that is sometimes called communitarian. It's not really left-wing or right-wing. It's people where you can get people on both the left and the right who've got a strong feel for and valuation of the idea of community. And it can be, but as I say, both a left and a right-leaning view. Now, those who are of a communitarian cast of mind, as many churches are, would want to say that, as I started off by saying, that you can't in fact detach a liberal market economy from some kind of moral inheritance and moral framework, and that we lack, and this is partly your point, we lack the resources to create such a framework once we've no longer inherited it, if you like, if it's been dissipated, if it's been undermined, and so on. We can't recreate it because the only building blocks that we've got are those of self-interest. So you can't actually recreate an ethos that has been undermined. What you can do, perhaps, as you suggested, is by regulation, but you've got to have some kind of agreement on what the regulation should be. And, again, as you suggested, once things are explicit in a regulation, people who work in the market economy are very clever, and they also have strong incentives. And they have strong incentives to think of ways around regulations, because however cleverly the regulation is devised, it can never be devised in such a way as to cover all eventualities and all situations. And therefore there is always going to be a gap between my self-interest and the regulatory framework around whatever it is that I'm doing. Whereas the critic will say, these communitarian critics will say, that what mattered in the past was that you internalized a kind of an ethos, a bit like Weber's Protestant ethic, and that governed how you behaved. But if that's now gone, and all we have is self-interest, then actually even regulation won't manage that. So what do? Well, there are two alternative approaches here, I think, and again, this is to look ahead a bit. But one is to say, well, look, what we should be doing is, first of all, to have very clear limits about markets, and we won't have markets in this field, that field, the other field, where these problems will arise if we let markets move into those fields. That's one sort of response. And what we should also do alongside restricting markets on this view is to bolster up those areas of our life where markets don't operate, say in the voluntary sector or in that area that I was talking about earlier, stressing these common values that we have that you can neither buy nor sell, nor for that matter turn into rights and regulations. So we should be trying to bolster up the kind of non-market order in the hope that some of its values would spill over, if you like, into how the market is regulated and how people behave. Now that may be regarded as a bit of a counsel of perfection, if you're right, it's never going to work. The other alternative is to look at ways in which the market itself could create other kinds of constraints other than those of regulation, so that in a sense the adoption of good behaviour might drive out bad behaviour purely as a matter of self-interest. So, for example, well, again, this is a very big argument. It will come up later on, but I'll just mention it for now. I can't really get into it. But things like branding and franchising might be regarded as ways of trying to create a framework of value that it is in people's self-interest to follow. So, if I own a brand that has trust and so on, then I can perhaps extend that brand, so long as I know about the supply chains and so forth of people that I'm franchising, but I could extend that brand through franchising and so forth to create other kinds of self-interested relationships, but relationships that drive out the bad in favour of the good, through assuming that the brand is a good brand and is a reputable brand and so forth. So that we're all keen on our reputations. Brands are reputational, essentially, and that those branding forms can provide a kind of standard about what is good and bad in a sort of way that arises within the market itself and isn't a matter of trying to bring in stuff from the non-market ethos, which in any case may have been dissipated by now.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.